The morning I came home from my fishing trip up near Temagami, I already knew what I was going to find. I'd driven the 4 hours back from the lake alone, windows down, the smell of pine and cold water still on my jacket. When I pulled onto Ridgewood Crescent and saw my house, the house I'd spent 31 years paying for, maintaining, loving, I sat in the truck for a long moment before I even reached for the door handle. The locksmith had been there. I could tell by the fresh scratch marks around the deadbolt. Small things. Most people wouldn't notice. But I'm a retired contractor. I notice everything. I walked up to the front door, put my key in the lock, and felt nothing. The key turned halfway and stopped. I stood there on my own porch in Sudbury, Ontario, with a bag of fishing gear on my shoulder and a key that no longer opened my own front door. And I did something my son almost certainly did not expect. I smiled. Then, I pulled out my phone and sent a text to my lawyer, Patricia Okafor, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. 3 words. It happened. Go. My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 64 years old. I worked 38 years in residential construction. Spent the last 12 of those running my own small contracting business out of northern Ontario. I retired at 62 with a paid-off house, a modest RRSP, and the kind of quiet pride that comes from building something with your own hands and keeping it standing. My wife, Diane, passed away 6 years ago, breast cancer. It was fast, and it was terrible, and it left me in a house that felt about twice as large as it needed to be. My son, Trevor, was 35 when she died. He lived in Barrie then, about 2 hours south, with his wife Sandra and their 2 kids. After the funeral, Trevor started calling more often. At first I thought it was grief. I thought he was checking on me the same way I was quietly checking on myself. I was wrong about what those phone calls were really about. But it took me almost 2 years to understand that. The house on Ridgewood Crescent is worth somewhere around $740,000 now. When Diane and I bought it in 1993, we paid $182,000. We replaced the roof in 2011, the furnace in 2016, the kitchen in 2019. I did most of the work myself or with people I trusted. The house is in good shape. Solid bones, as I used to tell clients. After Diane died, Trevor began coming up to Sudbury more often. He and Sandra would stay for weekends. The grandkids would run around the backyard. I loved those visits. I was lonely in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself, and having the house full of noise again felt like medicine. But somewhere in the second year, the visits started to change in a way I couldn't quite name at first. Trevor began asking questions. Not personal questions, not questions about how I was feeling or whether I was eating well. These were different. He asked about the mortgage, which had been paid off for years. He asked whether I'd thought about updating my will. He asked if I'd considered whether the house was really practical for one person. That word practical came up a lot. Dad, be practical. The yard is a lot of work for one person. Dad, be practical. What happens if you fall on those stairs in winter? Dad, be practical. You're sitting on a gold mine here. You could sell, move somewhere easier, and have money left over to actually enjoy. I told him each time that I was fine, that I liked the yard, that I'd been navigating those stairs for 30 years and hadn't fallen yet, that I wasn't interested in selling. He'd nod and let it go, and then 3 weeks later, the same conversation would start again from a slightly different angle. Sandra was warmer about it, which made it harder to object to. She'd bring it up over dinner, gently, framing it as concern. We just worry about you up here alone, Walter. The winters are brutal. It's so far from us. She had a way of making the conversation sound like love, and maybe part of it was. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that love and interest can look very similar from the outside, and sometimes you have to look carefully at the seams to tell them apart. The shift happened about 1.5 years ago. Trevor called me on a Tuesday evening in early November. Sandra wasn't on the call, which was unusual. She was almost always there, softening things. He got to the point faster than normal. Dad, I need to talk to you about something serious. Sandra and I are in trouble financially. Not catastrophic, but serious. We overextended on the renovation last spring, and the interest payments are killing us. I don't want to ask you for money. I know that's not fair. But I've been thinking, if you were ever going to sell the house, now would be the time. The market is still strong up there. You could sell, take a small apartment, or move closer to us, and be comfortable for the rest of your life. We could help you find something. I asked him how much debt he was carrying. He paused, then said, "About 90,000. I told him I needed to think about it. I did think about it, but not the way he expected. I have a friend named Gordon Tate who retired from the OPP 3 years ago. We've been fishing together since our 40s. Over coffee, the week after Trevor's call, I told Gordon what had been happening. The pressure, the slow escalation, the phone call. Gordon is not a dramatic person. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I was done, he put down his mug and said, "Walt, get your paperwork in order. All of it. Your deed, your will, your power of attorney. And call a lawyer before you do anything else." I drove to Patricia Okafor's office the following Monday. I'd used her firm twice before for contract disputes in the business. She's sharp, and she doesn't waste words, which I appreciate. I told her everything. She listened, made notes, and then asked me a question that changed the direction of things. "Walter, are you currently the sole person with signing authority on this property?" I said yes. She said, "Then we need to make sure it stays that way, and we need to document everything going forward." We spent 2 hours in that office. By the end, I had a clear plan, a trust structure in place, and a very specific set of instructions for what to do if Trevor or Sandra attempted to move forward with anything, a sale, a power of attorney application, anything, without my full knowledge and explicit participation. Patricia also told me something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "The people who do this to elderly parents are often not monsters. They're people who've convinced themselves they're being practical. The word they use is practical. Watch for that word." I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. 2 weeks later, Trevor called again. His tone had shifted. Less patient now, more procedural. He told me he'd looked into some options and spoken to a real estate agent in Sudbury, a man named Holt, who had apparently assessed the property and felt confident it could move quickly in the current market. I asked Trevor when he had arranged for someone to assess my house. He said, "Dad, I was just gathering information." I said, "Trevor, that's my house. Nobody assesses it without my permission." He apologized. He said he'd gotten ahead of himself, that he was just trying to help. I told him I understood, that I wasn't angry, that we'd talk more about it after Christmas. I was already recording the conversation. Patricia had advised me, after confirming the legal requirements in Ontario, that I could legally record phone calls I was a party to. From that point forward, I recorded every call from Trevor and Sandra. I also installed 2 security cameras on the exterior of the house, positioned to cover the front door and the side entrance to the garage. A friend who does home automation helped me set them up. I didn't tell Trevor about them. Christmas came and went. Trevor, Sandra, and the grandkids came up for 3 days. It was strained, though we kept it civil for the kids' sake. I watched Trevor more carefully than I ever had before. He was distracted. He kept stepping away to take calls. At one point I walked past the spare bedroom and heard him on the phone saying the words "before spring." Ideally. I didn't confront him. I noted it. In February, Gordon called me from his truck outside a coffee shop in Chelmsford. He said he'd run into Darren Holt, the real estate agent Trevor had spoken to at a hockey game. Holt had mentioned, apparently without realizing the connection, that he was working on a listing for a property on Ridgewood Crescent. Gordon had kept his face neutral, asked a few casual questions, and called me the moment he was alone. I called Patricia from my kitchen table with the snow coming down outside the window. She was quiet for a moment after I told her, then said, "All right, Walter. I think it's time to set the conditions and wait." We discussed it carefully. The house was in my name. Any legitimate sale required my signature. Any power of attorney over my affairs required my willing and witnessed consent. Trevor had no legal pathway to sell this property not without committing fraud. And fraud, Patricia explained, leaves a paper trail. She advised me to do the following. Take a trip. Tell Trevor about it. Make it sound like I was going away for 10 days or 2 weeks, long enough for him to feel the window was open. Don't ask questions. Don't raise suspicions. Just go. I booked a fishing trip up to Temagami with Gordon. 2 weeks at a cabin he knew, no reliable cell service, which I mentioned to Trevor when I told him about the trip. "You're going up north in March?" he said. "Dad, it'll be freezing." I said I'd always wanted to do a late winter trip. I said I was fine. I said I'd check in when I could. The morning I left, I drove my truck out of the driveway and around the corner, then parked it at Gordon's place 3 streets over. Gordon drove us both to the cabin in his truck. Anyone watching my house would see that my truck was gone. Patricia had advised me that if Trevor was planning to move forward, he would likely do so while I appeared to be unreachable. We were at the cabin for 11 days. On day 8, Patricia sent me an encrypted message through a secure app we'd set up for this. Activity on the property. Holt has been there twice. Someone changed the locks. I read that message, sitting on a dock in -12 weather with a fishing line in an ice hole, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not even satisfaction. More like the quiet resolution that comes when something you've been dreading finally stops being a fear and becomes a fact. I wrote back, understood. Stand by. On day 11, Gordon drove me back to Sudbury. We parked his truck at his place. I walked to mine, and I drove home down Ridgewood Crescent just as the afternoon light was going flat and gray over the snow. I parked in my own driveway, walked up my own front porch, put my key in my own front door, and felt it stop. I stood there for a moment. The street was quiet. A cardinal was sitting in the cedar hedge. I could hear it. Then I took out my phone and sent Patricia 3 words. It happened. Go. She had already been in contact with the Sudbury detachment of the Ontario Provincial Police. She had already filed the documentation. What followed over the next 72 hours was not dramatic, it was procedural, which is somehow worse than dramatic if you're the one who caused it. Trevor and Sandra had hired Holt to list the property and had provided documentation to support the listing documentation that included a power of attorney form bearing my signature, notarized by someone I had never met and never authorized. The signature was a forgery. This is a serious criminal matter in Canada. It falls under fraud provisions of the Criminal Code, and it carries significant consequences. Trevor called me the evening after the OPP made contact with him. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it, flat, almost airless. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" I said, "Trevor, I didn't do anything. I went fishing." "What did you do?" There was a long silence. I told him I loved him. I told him I was deeply, genuinely sorry that it had come to this. I told him that the decision to move forward with what he'd done was his, made by him, and that I hadn't set this situation in motion. I had only prepared myself for it. He asked if I would drop the complaint. I told him that was no longer within my power to decide unilaterally. Patricia had filed on my behalf, and the matter was with the authorities. What happened next depended on what Trevor chose to do in cooperation with the investigation. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time. The house was very quiet. Trevor and Sandra retained a lawyer. The investigation took several months. I won't detail the legal outcomes fully, but I will say this. The forged power of attorney was confirmed as fraudulent. Trevor avoided criminal charges by the narrowest of margins, largely through restitution agreements and full cooperation. He and Sandra lost the house they'd refinanced to cover their debts. The bank moved on it 6 months later when they couldn't maintain the payments. The $90,000 of debt they'd been trying to solve was still there, plus legal fees on top of it. I still live on Ridgewood Crescent. The house is still mine. In the spring, I refinished the back deck, the same deck Diane and I had coffee on every morning from May through October. I did it myself, mostly, with some help from a neighbor's kid who's learning the trade. I think about what happened more than I expected to. Not with anger, the anger burned off a long time ago, sometime during those 11 days on the ice at Temagami. What I think about mostly is the word Patricia used when I first sat in her office, practical. Trevor had told himself a story in which what he was doing was practical, a story in which an old man alone in a big house was a problem to be managed, a story in which his financial trouble justified borrowing against someone else's future without asking. The thing about that story is that it requires you to stop seeing the person at the center of it as fully a person. It requires a kind of quiet erasure. You have to start seeing your father as a situation rather than a man. I wasn't a situation. I was paying attention. I had been paying attention for a long time. If you're reading this and you're somewhere in your 60s, living alone, and someone in your life keeps using the word practical to describe what should happen to your home, your savings, your independence, pay attention. Call a lawyer before you sign anything. Record your conversations where the law permits you to. Tell a friend you trust what is happening. The people who would take advantage of you are often not strangers. They are often people who genuinely believe, on some level, that they are helping. That belief does not protect you. And if you're reading this as a son or daughter who has ever looked at an aging parent's house and thought about what it might be worth, I would ask you to sit with that thought for a moment. Ask yourself whether you're thinking about your parent or about the asset. Ask yourself what your mother or father actually wants. Ask yourself whether the word practical is something you're using to describe their needs or yours. There is no inheritance worth what it costs to take it before it's given. My father built things with his hands his entire life and died in his own bed in the house he'd owned for 40 years. I used to think that was just luck. I understand now that it was also stubbornness. And stubbornness is something I inherited from him completely. I'm 64 years old. I have, if I'm fortunate, another 25 or 30 years ahead of me. I plan to spend them in my house, on my street, with my cardinal in the cedar hedge and my coffee on the back deck in the morning. Anyone who wants to discuss that is welcome to call me. My lawyer's number is on file.